So continuing on with 2.2, we are going to move on to the skin for our veterinary technician online review course. So the skin has different functions. The first one obviously is protection. It protects us against UV lights, mechanical, thermal, and chemical stresses, dehydration, and invasion of microorganisms. It helps us with sensation. So the skin has receptors that sense touch, pressure, pain, and temperature on it. It also helps us thermoregulate. So various features of the skin are involved in regulating body temperatures. For example, our sweat glands, the hair, and adipose tissue. And then lastly, metabolic function. So subcutaneous adipose is involved in the production of vitamin D and triglycerides. So the skin consists of three different layers. As you can see on this picture, the very top layer is called the epidermis, hence epi, meaning top. And then the middle part is the dermis. And then the very last part is the hypodermis, or the subcutaneous layer. So let's start with the epidermis. The epidermis itself, of course, the subcategory to this subcategory, the epidermis has 5 different types of layers. The first one is the stratum germinativum, which is also called the basal layer. After that, there is the stratum spinosum, which is also called the spiny layer, which you guys will see a picture of, and you'll see why it's called the spiny layer. It has these spiny type protrusions. The stratum granulosum, and this is also called the granular middle layer. The stratum lucidum, which is also called the clear layer, and then the stratum corneum, which is the horny outermost layer of the epidermis. So the very tip top of the epidermis is the stratum corneum. So in the epidermis, cells divide in the basal layer and move up through the other layers, and they change their appearance as they move from one layer to the next. It takes around 2 to 4 weeks for this to happen. So for the layers of the epidermis to get all the way to the top and slough off, it takes 2 to 4 weeks for this to happen. This continuous replacement of cells in the epidermis layer of skin is important. Okay, the epidermal layer of the skin and digestive tract are directly exposed to the outside world and therefore are the most vulnerable to its damaging effects. And that's why this epidermis is constantly sloughing off. In both, there is constant proliferation of the cells in the bottom layer, which is the stratum basale, which constantly move up to the top where they are lost. So it's constantly regenerating itself. So this means damaged cells are continuously shed and then replaced with new cells. This here you can see the different layers of the epidermis. This is the stratum basale. This is the very, very bottom layer. So right underneath here is the dermis. So this is the deepest layer of your epidermis, is your stratum basale. After that, these cells will make their way up to the stratum spinosum. This picture doesn't depict it very well, but if you see in other ones, you can see how it's connected to the next layer, and it has these spiny protrusions through it. And then the middle layer here is the stratum granulosum, and it's called that because it actually has these granules within it that may be visible. After that, we have our stratum lucidum, which is actually a clear kind of, all these cells are dead at this point and clear. And then we have our stratum corneum, which is the most superficial layer, and this is where the cells actually slough off. So if you go ahead and scratch a dog on its back and you see some of those white flakes, those are actually sloughing off from the stratum corneum, the very tip-top layer of that epidermis. And it took 2 to 4 weeks for that those white flakes to make its way up to the top, because it used to be down at the stratum basale. This here is showing you microscopically what the layers of the epidermis look like. You can see the dermis is down here, the stratum basale is right down here, and then the stratum spinosum is right here, and then the granulosum and lucidum and corneum all the way up to the top where the skin is actually sloughing off. The basal layer, the stratum germinativum, so it's the deepest layer, it's closest to the dermis. It consists of one single row of keratocytes, and the keratocytes produce keratin, the tough fibrous waterproof protein that gives its skin its resilience and strength. and it attaches to the epithelial basement membrane. So the basement membrane actually attaches this basal layer to the dermis. Also, Merkel cells, which is associated with sensory nerve endings, and melanocytes, which produce melanin pigment, so it's the actual color, are found within the basal layer. This right here is showing you the basal layer. This is the dermis right here, and the basal layer is just this one single simple layer, and that's where it is there. And that's where you can see a melanocyte that's attached here at the basal layer, which gives the skin its color. The next layer, the spiny layer, the stratum spinosum, it contains several layers as opposed to the basal layer, which just has one. It contains several layers of cells held together by desmosomes. Now, I don't know if you guys remember, but a few PowerPoints back, we talked about desmosomes being the connection between two cells. And Langerhans cells, which are phagocytic, and they may be involved also in allergies and cell-mediated immune responses of the skin, are found within the stratum spinosum. So you can see the picture down here showing the stratum spinosum. The granular middle layer, the stratum granulosum, is composed of 2 to 4 layers of flattened diamond-shaped keratocytes that secrete lamellated granules of glycolipids. So we were talking about it having granules. So these granules of glycolipids result in the formation of an impermeable lipid-containing membrane that serves as a water barrier. That's how our skin ends up being waterproof, is thanks to this granular middle layer. Plays a role in helping waterproof the skin and slowing water loss across the epidermis. And this right here will show you the stratum granulosum, which is the third layer. The clear layer, the stratum lucidum, it's named for its translucent appearance under a microscope, which you can see being pointed at here on this picture. It's only found in very thick skin. So if we're talking about very thin skin, it's actually that thin skin is not going to have this stratum lucidum, but thick skin, for example, the nose of a dog or on the pads of the feet of a dog or a cat, you're going to have this layer, and it's the clear layer, and it's composed of a few rows of flattened dead keratocytes. And then we have the stratum corneum, which is the horny outermost layer. It's composed of 20 to 30 rows of dead cells, and sometimes called horny or cornified cells. So it's the very top one. So we did talk about in the last one, especially with the clear layer of the epidermis as the thick skin as opposed to the thin skin. So thin skin skin that has hair on it usually consists of 3, maybe 4 epidermal layers rather than all 5 of them. So typically they'll have the basale, the spinosum, and then it'll just go straight to the corneum. Whereas the thick skin has all 5 layers, so the granulosum as well as the lucidum. Thick skin has a thinner dermis than the thin skin and does not contain hairs, sebaceous glands, or apocrine sweat glands. Thick skin is only found in areas where there is a lot of abrasions, so fingertips, palms, foot pads, and the soles of the feet. Those are all areas where you're going to find thick skin, and typically there's no hair there, and you'll have all 5 layers of this epidermis. So this right here is showing you thin skin as opposed to thick skin, so you can see the different layers, and here on the thick skin you're going to have the stratum lucidum, and you're also going to have the granulosum layer as well. But you can see the difference between the thin skin and the thick skin, and here's a hair shaft coming out of the thin skin, but you won't find that on the thick skin. So let's move on to the dermis. The dermis is composed of dense, irregular connective tissue. So we've already talked about connective tissue and different types of. This one specifically is dense irregular. So it's made up of collagen, elastic, and reticular fibers. It includes hair follicles, nerve endings, glands, smooth muscle, blood vessels, and lymphatics within the dermis. Okay, so it's a lot busier than the epidermis is, which is just layers of these cells. The dermis itself contains all of these things, and thankfully, the subcategory to this category, there's only two types of layers: the papillary layer and the reticular layer. So you can see here the reticular layer is the thicker part of the dermis, and the papillary layer is just the very tip top. So the papillary layer is what lies right above the basal surface of the epidermis. So you can see that if we lift off the epidermis here, you can see the papillary layer right here, which is all these like spiny kind of protrusions here. And then anything under that is the reticular layer of the dermis, which contains all the hair follicles and nerve endings and stuff. Well, so does the papillary layer, but obviously you'll find more in the reticular layer due to its size. The papillary layer of the dermis is underneath the epithelial layer of the epidermis. So it's the very tip top of the dermis. It's composed of loose connective tissue with loosely woven fibers and ground substance. Dermal papillae help cement the epidermis and the dermis together. And blood vessels, pain, temperature, and touch receptors are also present within the papillary layer of the dermis. The reticular layer, which is the thickest part of the dermis, consists of dense irregular connective tissue, bundles of collagen fibers from the papillary layer blend into those of the reticular layer. And then finally, the hypodermis, also called the subcutaneous layer or the fatty layer or sub-Q, however you want to call it. It's composed of areolar tissue containing adipose, blood, and lymphatic vessels and nerves. Fibers of the hypodermis are continuous with those of the dermis, and the hypodermal layer permits the skin to move freely under the underlying bone and muscle without putting tension on itself.